Here we go. Okay, this is What's Up Wichita, and we have our guest this morning, and his name is Doug Schroeder. And Doug has been appointed as the new Executive Director for the Kscpost. Now, many of you will not know what that is, and so I will have Doug introduce himself and tell us about his career in law enforcement and how he got to the position he is right now, and he'll tell you about what Kscpost does. Okay, Mr. Schroeder, glad to have you, sir. I'm glad you could join us, and we appreciate you. Appreciate your time. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you and let you give the audience a background of where you come from, how long you spent in law enforcement, and how you rose to the position you have now.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here today. It's been good to get to know you in the last couple of minutes and through our emails. So yeah, my name's Doug Schroeder. I've been a law enforcement officer for quite a while. Let me tell you a quick story about becoming a law enforcement officer. When I was a senior in high school, it was kind of the time to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, right?
Okay.
Was I going to go to college? What kind of path I was going to take? And I wasn't real sure. And back in those days, there were limited computer programs, but we did have one back in my high school that I went online, or not online. Online wasn't available yet. I put this disc in. I took a test, and it was supposed to tell me what I would like to do, basically as a profession, where I would succeed, what I might not like to do, where I might, struggle.
Mhm.
And so at the end of that test, it spit out some results. And one of the results was that it said that I would be good at teaching.
Okay.
And little to my knowledge that I have now, I thought, well, that's just not a very dynamic environment. It's the same thing over and over with the same people. Again, fast forward to today, I have so much respect for teachers and what they do, and it is an ever-changing environment. Anyway, one of the things that it said that I would not be good at, that I would least like, is law enforcement.
Okay.
And I don't know if today it is because of just my personality, or it was a flaw in the computer program, but
Okay.
I checked into that. And so after high school, I went to community college, got an associate's degree. And because I was scared of student loans, I immediately, upon age 21, started my law enforcement career. And that was in 1996. And so I was a law enforcement officer for a number of years, had the opportunity to become police chief in Heston. And I had learned a lot from my mentor and the former police chief here in Heston. And so I took that leap of faith in 2001. And I ended up going back to school throughout my career. I've got a graduate degree from Fort Hays State. I've tied back in to that same high school test in that I do some adjunct instructing with several area colleges in their criminal justice department. So it kind of came full swing, but it happened in about 25 years.
Okay.
So here in 2021, just earlier this month, I started the next, I think, phase or step of my career. After being a police chief for 20 years here in Heston, I applied for and was appointed the Executive Director of the Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, or Kscpost as we call it. So the past 3 weeks, I've been just kind of immersing myself in that culture and making those, those relationships that will benefit mutually both the departments and in my office, and just kind of going from there. So that's it in a nutshell, Mr. Barfield, where I've been and where we're going.
Okay, very good. Now the I call it the compost, but KC. Okay, so let me ask you this: tell me, what is the mission of the organization?
Yeah. So the mission is, if I were to define the mission, it is to try to work with law enforcement agencies towards more professionalism. And that is, if you go on our website, that's not word for word our mission, but if I had to quantify it down to that. So that takes place in a couple of different ways. First of all, we have some folks that work on the database. By statute, Kspost is charged with creating and maintaining a central registry database for all law enforcement officer training in Kansas. So what that means is, and a lot of folks don't realize that here in Kansas, law enforcement officers, once they're certified, they have to have a minimum of 40 hours of continuing ed each and every year to maintain that certification. And furthermore, a lot of people don't realize that Kansas is kind of the leader in the nation on that. There are only a couple of other states that mandate that much continuing education. So I feel that Kansas has been very proactive in the area of educating and training our officers. So we have folks that maintain the central registry with that, making sure that everybody gets their 40 hours. And not only that, there are certain areas in which officers have to get those 40 hours, right? So through the Attorney General's work several years ago, we established that every year officers have to attend training in bias-based policing. Also, several years ago, a firearms course was certified as an annual course that officers must complete and satisfy with a passing grade. And so those are some areas that we look at to make sure those officers get that. Kind of another side to the Kspost is also determining licensing status. So if someone were to be hired as a police officer, they're given a provisional license. It means that this license is in effect until you graduate the police academy. And there are several police academies throughout Kansas. They all answer to the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center and Director Darren Beck, and also through the University of Kansas. But those satellite academies such as Wichita, Sedgwick County, Johnson County, Topeka, that sort of thing, they'll have a curriculum that has been approved by the Kspost. And once officers complete that academy, they're given their license. Their provisional license is, of course, only until that point. So they're given a license. But much like our license to drive in Kansas, that license isn't a privilege. It's not guaranteed. It's a privilege, meaning that you can lose it should you not comply with certain things like getting your hours in, getting your training hours in. Also, if any officer or certified person commits a felony, a second DUI, or I believe it's 52 different misdemeanors that the Kansas administrative regulations have identified, we have investigators at Kspost that look into those allegations. And if it is a Training Act violation, Kspost has an administrative procedure to remove the license from that officer, meaning that, whatever they did, maybe they get fired from their agency, but then maybe they'd go, just a couple counties over and get a job. Well, if they get their license removed as a peace officer in Kansas, they can't do that. As a matter of fact, we report those license revocations to a national database. So should this officer that has done something to get their license revoked want to go to Michigan and be an officer, they would have access to see that Kansas has revoked their license. So it's a very robust, I think, level of accountability. It's one that not too many folks know about, and that's why, Mr. Barfield, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, because I want the public to know what accountability measures there are, not only through their own agencies, but also at a state level.
Okay, first of all, let me apologize, sir. I introduced you as Schroeder, and you pronounce it Schroeder. I apologize for that. Okay.
Oh, no, that is fine.
Now, let me ask you this. When you say that you're over uh, law enforcement through Kansas, does that include the sheriff's office, the highway patrol, or just the just the police officers?
No, that's a good question. So any law enforcement officer with powers of arrest in Kansas, they are licensed. So even the highway patrol,
Mhm.
excuse me, sheriff's offices, KBI agents, and also municipal, Wichita PD, Newton PD, all of those. So there are just over 8,000 licensed law enforcement officers in Kansas.
Okay. And you mentioned about the bias-based training. Now, I remember I attended one of those back in, I believe it was like 2014 or 2015, somewhere in there. Are those still run by Betty Friedel?
There are a number of different sources. I'm not familiar with that, but I've 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 been privileged to hear a number of different folks speak on areas surrounding bias-based policing and constitutional policing, implicit and explicit bias. Our local academy has a few options to both get that training in person and in a virtual environment. There are a number of other national organizations that can provide that, again, in person or in a virtual environment. So there's a lot of options out there.
Okay. Now, sticking with the bias-based policing, are officers, do they just attend one session or do they do this on a regular basis?
It really depends. The Attorney General's recommendations are that they receive training annually.
Okay.
So it's really up to the agency administrator to say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that they attend in person or they attend virtually? Does that mean they do the same training year after year? Probably not a good idea. We want to diversify that, right? Does that mean that it is 1 hour to satisfy that requirement? Or does it take 8 hours to satisfy that requirement? A lot of that is left up to the individual agency administrator.
Okay. And primarily, is that intended for cities like Wichita, Kansas City, maybe in Topeka, or does that also include places like Heston, Newton, Wellington? Do those departments still have to go through the same training?
Yeah, I mean, under the same title of bias-based policing, yes, not necessarily the same training through the same source, but absolutely, that reaches from corner to corner in Kansas. It covers large agencies and small agencies. Kind of what I've heard from some administrators around the state is in some of those more rural areas, it's hard to bring in experts. It's hard to bring in folks that can relate to the topic and then convey that to their law enforcement officers. I think the larger areas, the more populated areas, have a better, I guess, just a better access to those sorts of resources. But everybody across the state, corner to corner, needs to comply with that.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the one of the things that attracted me initially was you, as I understand it, are kind of committed to doing what you can do to mend the relationships between African Americans, Hispanics, and these various law enforcement agencies. What do you see, number one, as the major problem?
The major problem, boy, that's hard to define. I think one of the problems that we have is just being able to relate to each other and not having the conversations out of either fear or anger or whatever it might be. So I am one that is very much a supporter of gathering around the table and talking about it, having those discussions, kind of like what we're doing right now, what your listeners are hearing. And even at the end of the day, there may not be on every topic total agreement, right? But having those conversations helps both sides grow and create those relationships that will last through the weathering storms. And so yeah, just coming together, I think having those discussions, it needs to take place, and it needs to continue to take place. You can't just do it and then move on. We can't just wait for the next national or event to say, oh my, we can't stand for this anymore.
Sure.
It needs to be happening week to week. And I've worked with a number of groups in that area. I've experienced growth through that. And I think that's probably why I feel like that is such a positive thing for all of law enforcement to engage.
Okay. Now, coming from Heston, which is a pretty small community, you probably are not aware, well, maybe that's not the right word, but you haven't been confronted with the same problems as, say, a police chief in Wichita or Kansas City or maybe a Topeka. So I don't fully know, and I don't want to make any assumptions, but how familiar are you to the mistrust that exists between people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, whatever, and these police departments?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm familiar with it because one thing that rings true throughout law enforcement is, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily fair, but when something happens in our nation, I think we're all painted with the same brush, right? So I'm in good connection with my peers around the state in some of those more populated areas. But Heston, small communities, rural communities, Western Kansas, we don't live in a bubble. We're part of the rest of the world. We see that. Sometimes law enforcement is accused of that. And my take on that is communication can only improve it. So yeah, very much aware. I mean, the temperature of our country is something we need to work on. We need to continue to work on.
Okay. Now I'm sure you've heard the general. Well, it's kind of general. A lot of these allegations could be solved through better training, police department training. Now, I'm a little different. My feeling is that all these officers receive the same training in general. But if you have a rogue, what I'm going to determine as a rogue officer, no amount of training is going to straighten that guy out, because he's got his mindset on how he wants to be a police officer and how he wants to treat people in certain communities. So I say it's really not about training. Now, one of the things that I'm a fan of is I think we miss a lot of these rogue officers through the hiring process, because I don't think we actually give them the proper amount of attention to their past. And as you, I'm sure, aware of, the FBI has stated, and they have documented, that in this day and age, a large number of white supremacists and members of racial hatred groups are infiltrating or attempting to infiltrate law enforcement agencies throughout the country. And these guys do it for one reason, because they can go in and do whatever the heck they want to do without any consequences because of the qualified immunity that is afforded police officers. Do you see that as a problem?
Well, I would agree with you very much so that it takes a special person to be a law enforcement officer, and that no amount of training can teach somebody how to be compassionate,
Mhm.
how to have emotional intelligence, how to, even when, um, stress is high, how to have that composure. It takes a special person to do that. And law enforcement, and in my past as police chief, I find that's just one of our biggest, most important decisions is in hiring. Because we, like you said, we've got good training programs, right? They're vetted in research. There's data to support what we train officers to go out and do. There's expectations of the public of that. But if you hire somebody without the emotional intelligence to be able to carry that out, it's not going to happen. So I echo that response. Unfortunately, it's kind of been one of those spirals, right? Those downward spirals, because we want more applicants. We want more diverse applicants. But the temperature of the United States and some of the conflict and some of what's happened on the news has prevented folks from wanting to be a part of something good. And I do, in my heart, as I think you share, law enforcement is needed. It is something good. But police, our people don't see that very often. And we want good people to apply, we'll train them well, and we'll have a good outcome because of that. But it all starts with the good people applying. And, in my last year as police chief, I've never had such a poor applicant pool in numbers.
Mhm.
I think we need to reverse that. We need to get more applicants. We need to be transparent and show people what we do in the community and how that helps the community. And that's a reward in and of itself.
Well, along that vein, let me say this. I also feel that as the law enforcement should have a presence in these communities with the people that they're controlling, and in other words, present themselves in a different light than just being an arresting officer or looking for trouble. I think build some relationships, go out in the community when you're off duty if necessary, okay? And familiarize yourself with the people, they become familiarized with you. And I think that makes for a better relationship right there. They don't just view you as someone that the only time they see you is when you're accusing them of doing something wrong, violating the law. So
Yeah.
that's the way they're going to see you. And that's the way you see them. You see, all too often times, Black men in particular are seen as suspects, not as normal people, not as working people, just as suspects. And that's what officers generally look for. And so if you're not on a good first name or whatever type of relationship with individuals, then you have just what you're just talking about. You have a difficulty attracting good people because of the distrust that they have, and
Yeah.
the way they see you, and the way they think you see them. And for instance, the common theme in the Black community is that too many times officers stop individuals for pretext traffic stops, okay? And such things as tag light out, okay? Failure to make a left turn signal within 500 or 300, whatever it is, okay? And these are things that we see non Black and Hispanic and Asian people, they don't get stopped for a headlight out, I see people all the time driving down the street at night with one headlight out. And I'm thinking now, if that was me, I wouldn't get 2 blocks from home with that because, I'd be stopped and pulled over. But the other thing I want to mention to you is I've oftentimes said that officers, with all their training, and even when I went to the training center over there, I suggested that officers all across the state, when you make a traffic stop, the first thing you do is identify yourself, and you tell the violator or the driver of the car why you stopped them. In my opinion, oftentimes that can de-escalate a situation. because normally people react to an act. And if an officer is unprofessional, then he's going to get usually a bad reaction from the person that he stopped. But I found that if an officer, and I've had it happen to me, when they stop me, they say, hey, look, my name is Officer so and so and so, and the reason I stopped you today is you were going 40 and a 30. You know what I mean? Well, right there. Because if you don't do that, the first thing that the driver says is, what did you stop me for? You know, well, what did I do? You know, no, I didn't do that. You know, so I think if an officer presents himself in a professional manner, oftentimes he can de-escalate, especially when you're talking about a non-violent situation, just a traffic stop. The guy's not accused of being a murderer or a robber or anything like that. He ran a stoplight, you know, but you can diffuse the situation according to how you handle and conduct yourself.
Yeah. Hey, there's a lot there that you said that I agree with, and it you know, to unpack it all, it may take us another hour. I've got nothing else to do. I don't know about you, but one of your earlier points I did want to respond to. I am a huge fan of Sir Robert Peel. He was over in Europe and is basically the grandfather of what American law enforcement is. And if you were to Google or look up Sir Robert Peel, you'll see that he has authored several principles. And one of those principles is that the police are the public and the public are the police, meaning that we aren't on sides. You know, it's
Right.
not us against you. It's Schroeder is maybe a police officer, but you know what? He's also a dad.
Mm-hmm.
He's also coaches rec soccer. He also has hobbies. He also has a friend group. He's not just a police officer. He is part of the public. And the same thing is, you know, we want our public to fulfill the role of officer because they love their community. They want to see their community thrive. So I'm a huge fan of the Peelian principles, that being one of them. As a matter of fact, I wrote my graduate thesis on police legitimacy and really based it on the principles that were written back in the 1800s by Robert Peel. So I agree with much of what you said. I've always taught my officers to identify themselves and the reason why they were stopped. I believe that the academies, although it's been a long time since I've been in police academy, I believe they train traffic stops in that same traffic and pedestrian stops, really any contacts that a law enforcement officer might have in that same way. Introduce yourself, tell them why, the reason why you're introducing themselves, and go from there.
Now, I want to talk about something else that escalates the distrust or mistrust between members of the African American and Hispanic community. I'm going to go back to the Derek Chauvin case. Here we have an officer that had 18 complaints against him. None of those complaints, to the best of my knowledge, were thoroughly investigated. Now, somewhere along the line, there should have been a red flag. Okay, and I think what happens is, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Okay, so if an officer, we see numerous complaints coming in, that means that everybody cannot be wrong about this particular officer, and why would everybody single out this particular officer? So I think a good idea would be to, if you really investigate these and you really take the public seriously, take that officer out of that particular community and place him in another community and see if those complaints still, you know, generate. And if they do, there's no question you've got a bad officer. And this officer is going to bring embarrassment and sometimes a costly, it's going to have a costly outcome. And this is what we see all too often times when people make the complaints of misconduct, unprofessional, acting unprofessional, or being use of force, excessive use of force. All too often times, the chief or a sergeant or a lieutenant, whatever, will basically brush that aside, okay, or say we don't have any evidence, or it's his word against yours. Now, so when you have a situation like, say, like I just mentioned, Derek Chauvin, and we see what it finally came to, but now we see now that this has been his behavior for the past 15, 20 years, but nobody ever slapped him on the wrist. Nobody ever took it seriously. And so we get to that point. Now, that then gives the communities reasons to see, we've been telling you this for 5 or 10 years. Nobody believed us. Okay. So I think we have to come to the conclusion that when you have a department of 300, 400, 500, 600 officers, you've got to believe that there's a bad apple or two. You've got to believe that somewhere along the line, you're going to be confronted with a rogue officer. Okay, so you have to take seriously these complaints, no matter how often they come. You have to take each one case by case and delve into it seriously to find out what is behind it. What's your opinion on that?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think most departments engage in some sort of progressive discipline procedure. I admit I can't intelligently speak about the Chauvin case and any past discipline that he may have had or should have had. But I think we're lucky in this area of Kansas to have some of the police leaders that we do have. Chief Ramsey and Sheriff Easter, I'm a big fan of. I know they are trying to be as transparent as possible when it comes to officer discipline. And, I remember a couple times in the last year alone of seeing officers from those departments be disciplined and even arrested for what they've done off duty. Mm-hmm. And so kudos to those, kudos to the agency administrators that are towing that line. I think technology is changing in that area to benefit us. There are a number of early warning programs that are out there for large departments. Well, not only large departments, anybody can get it, but it's usually large departments that invest in it because they can, because they need to. Smaller, 10-person departments and that sort of thing are more hands-on with their supervisory roles and may not need it and nor be able to afford it. But I think you have a lot of good ideas there. One thing that I'm so in support of is gathering data. I know the Kansas Bureau of Investigations is currently working on a database through a reporting mechanism for agencies to submit use of force information, because we don't have good data on this in Kansas or really anywhere else. I mean, how many minorities are affected by use of force? How many, just the entire demographics of that picture, we don't have data on. We've got stories, we've got things that we can relate to. We can sometimes see this on video cams or body cams, that sort of thing, and take action on it. But just what percentage of who out there may have had force used against them? And so with good data, good info coming in, I think we can make plans and systems for better accountability, but it takes that good data. And so traffic stop data, person data, I know entities throughout the state are looking at how we can better compile that and then, be able to put those systems into place.
Now, what would it take to change that? Is that something we'll have to go through the state legislature, or can departments make that decision on their own?
A little bit of both. The hard thing about state mandates is that sometimes there's just not the funding or mechanism behind it to make it happen. But most departments seek that or see that there needs to be a way that they need to at least compile their own data. What I would like to see is the state of Kansas. I'm really excited about the Attorney General actually asked the KBI to institute this statewide. And so I think it's going to be a very robust system, and we can break it down by regions. We can break it down by jurisdictions. We can also look at state averages. And I think it's through some of those comparisons that we'll be able to find areas that we can grow.
Okay, I want to talk to you about a controversial issue here. We've seen an increased number of police shootings over the last few years. And one of the things that people often ask is, are officers trained to shoot to kill or shoot to stop? And, you know, when you see individuals being shot, unarmed individuals being shot and shot in the back or whatever, and shot in the head, why do officers not shoot to wound to stop the individual? Why must they shoot to kill?
Well, I've in 25 years of law enforcement, having trained with and having been trained by a number of different entities in just the area of firearms, use of force, use of deadly force, I've never seen anybody that advocate shooting to kill somebody. Law enforcement, every officer that I know would never want to kill somebody. What they are trained to do is to shoot to stop the threat or to stop the threat in some way, right? But sometimes that means that somebody loses their life. That's not the intentional method of using deadly force, but it's an unintended consequence of it. And that training has to be very robust. It needs to be not only on paper, not only lecture, but it has to be very hands-on and situational. We have to test officers in scenarios that are of high stress level and to see if they can perform. One thing that our Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center has done with their curriculum, I just absolutely applaud it. They've moved away from a lecture-based instruction where new recruits or academy recruits listen to a lecture and then get tested on it, to a method of almost every area of law enforcement, whether it's traffic stops, use of force, report writing, everything is accompanied by an action. Not only do you have to know what you're doing, but here's your test. Show me that you know it physically. Make them go through the mental repetitions of doing that task. And so I think we're making some strides in that area. Yeah, so I hope I answered your question. I went off on a tangent a little bit.
Well, let me say this to you. I do happen to know that you were involved in the Heston shooting at XL Manufacturing, I believe it is. And there you had an active shooter who certainly was a threat, posing a threat, taking lives. If my understanding is correctly, you were the one that took him down. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So there, I'm going back to your comment about police shooting to stop the threat. And what I'm saying is, in that situation, you stopped a threat. There was more than a threat. You stopped an action. But a guy that is running away from an officer and is shot in the back, where's the threat to the officer?
Yeah, I would answer that by there's probably not. There are a number of different areas of research out there that that would apply itself to this topic. And oftentimes we don't hear, on the news, all the facts of a case. But yeah, if the case is exactly how you described, there is no threat, so there should be no use of force at that point.
Okay, but now we have the fortune of having dash cams and video cams. So, sir, some of, and I want to say a lot of, but several of these altercations have been caught on either a dash cam or cell phone cameras, clearly showing. And one of them, excuse me, one of them was the most obvious was the one down in, I believe it was South Carolina or North Carolina, where the guy was, and there was clearly about a 30-foot distance between the two, and the guy's clearly running away, and he's still shot in the back. And then, to make matters worse, the officer goes, and after the guy's down on the ground, he's dead. Officer's planting a gun. I mean, you see, these are the kinds of things that give you guys a very bad reputation. And oftentimes what happens is, like you said in the very beginning, everybody's painted with the same brush, a broad brush, so that means it's not just you or that officer, it's the police department. You know what I mean? It's law enforcement, And I'm glad to see that finally we're getting to the place, and this was brought out in the Chauvin case, and it's happened since then. We're getting to the place where officers now are willing to talk about and tell the truth about what happened with the officer they were with. Well, before they didn't do that. You remember Serpico years ago? I don't know if you remember that. The Serpico guy in New York, the guy that talked and was blackballed pretty much, So, and there was what we call the wall of, what was the code of silence, blue or something like that. But anyhow, now we're getting officers that are willing to be upfront and speak out against if they see illegal action by an officer, even though if they're patrolling with him or whatever, they didn't do that. If you go back probably 2 years ago, that was almost non-existent. I think that's a big step in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, we've in law enforcement, I say we, in law enforcement, we've talked a lot about duty to intercede. If you see something that even your brother or sister in blue are doing and it's not right, it is upon you to get that changed. And again, this, the whole topic ties way back into who we are hiring, and that they must be of significant character. Because no matter what job you're in, if you see the culture of a place, and if it's a bad culture, it's hard to break that as a new person into that, right? So we have to be hiring emotionally intelligent people. We have to be hiring compassionate people that put their citizens first over their employment, over their perhaps bad culture at their work. And so, yeah, we've made some, I agree with you. And it's been recent, right? The last couple of years we've made those efforts, and we need to build upon those.
Mr. Schroeder, it's been a pleasure having you, sir, and I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
I think we're about out of time. So again, I was very pleased to have you, sir, and you answered a lot of questions, and I'll be looking forward to talking with you again in the future.
Sounds real good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and have a good day, sir.
This program is brought to you by Kscpost.